Long before dynasties emerged or chronicles were written, control over Eastern Europe was shaped not by kings or armies, but by rivers, vast natural corridors that connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and bound distant worlds into a single zone of movement, exchange, and competition. The geographic heartland of Ancient Rus occupied a broad expanse of Eastern Europe stretching between the Baltic and Black Seas. This region was defined by a transitional ecological zone known as the forest steppe, where dense northern woodlands gradually gave way to open grasslands in the south. Modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia formed the core of this landscape. Its physical features imposed both opportunities and constraints, shaping how communities settled, traded, and eventually organized politically. At the center of this system were the river networks. The Dnieper River flowed southward from the Valdai Hills to the Black Sea, forming the most direct artery between northern Europe and Byzantium. To the northeast, the Volga River linked the forests of Eastern Europe to the Caspian Sea and the Islamic world beyond. The Dniester, Western Dvina, and Don rivers further connected regional basins, creating a lattice of waterways unparalleled in early medieval Europe. Archaeological surveys consistently show that early settlements clustered along these riverbanks, confirming their role as the primary conduits of movement and communication. Records indicate that river travel was significantly more efficient than overland transport in this heavily forested terrain. Dense woodlands, marshes, and seasonal flooding limited the use of roads, especially before large-scale deforestation. As a result, rivers functioned as political highways, allowing relatively small groups to project influence over large distances. This geographic reality would later enable the rapid integration of disparate regions under early Rus rulers. Climate also played a decisive role. The region experienced a continental climate marked by long, cold winters and short agricultural seasons. Archaeological pollen analysis suggests that crop cultivation was viable but required careful management. Fertile Chernozem soils in the southern forest steppe supported grain agriculture, while northern zones relied more heavily on hunting, fishing, and limited farming. This ecological gradient encouraged economic specialization between regions, reinforcing interdependence and exchange. Forests supplied timber, furs, honey, and wax, commodities that became central to long-distance trade. Excavations at sites such as Staraya Latiga and Nezdovo reveal imported goods, including Islamic silver dirhams and Byzantine coins, indicating that these natural resources were exchanged far beyond the region itself. The abundance of fur-bearing animals in the northern forests made Eastern Europe an essential supplier within Eurasian trade networks by the early medieval period. The steppe frontier to the south introduced both opportunity and vulnerability. Open grasslands allowed for rapid movement of nomadic populations, including Scythians, Sarmatians, and later Turkic groups. Archaeological evidence of fortified settlements along the forest steppe boundary suggests persistent insecurity. Communities adapted by situating settlements near defensible river bends or elevated terrain, reinforcing the strategic value of geography in daily survival. According to Byzantine chroniclers, the rivers of Eastern Europe were already known routes by late antiquity, used by merchants and raiders alike. These waterways linked the northern world of the Baltic to Constantinople, enabling not only trade but also the transmission of ideas, technologies, and religious influences. Geography thus positioned the future Rus lands as an intermediary zone between civilizations rather than a peripheral frontier. The absence of natural barriers within much of the region further shaped its political development. Unlike mountainous or island societies, Eastern Europe lacked clear defensive boundaries. This openness encouraged mobility but limited the emergence of stable, territorially bounded states in the early period. Authority tended to follow routes of movement rather than fixed borders, a pattern visible in later Rus governance structures. Archaeologists uncovered evidence that early population density remained relatively low despite the region's size. Settlement patterns revealed dispersed communities connected through rivers rather than concentrated urban centers. This spatial organization delayed large-scale political centralization but facilitated the later rise of mobile elites capable of controlling trade routes instead of territory alone. By establishing the environmental parameters of the Eastern Slavic world, geography determined the basic conditions under which societies developed. Rivers structured economic life, forests supplied trade goods, and open frontiers exposed communities to external pressures. These factors did not dictate outcomes in isolation, but they defined the framework within which early populations adapted and interacted. As a result, the physical geography of Eastern Europe created a landscape where mobility, exchange, and regional interconnection preceded formal state structures. These conditions directly shaped the earliest human societies that occupied the region and laid the groundwork for the cultural and political developments that followed. Before we dive deeper into the history of Ancient Rus, take a moment to subscribe, click the bell icon to get the daily Nightfall history video, and share your favorite part of this section in the comments. Your feedback helps us explore history in even greater depth. Before written records, pottery styles and settlement remains reveal the earliest ancestors of the Rus, providing the only tangible evidence of communities that would shape Eastern Europe over millennia. The earliest known societies in the region date back to the Neolithic period, around 3000 BCE, when small, sedentary communities began cultivating crops and domesticating animals. Archaeological evidence from sites in modern Ukraine and Western Russia demonstrates the presence of linear pottery cultures and later the corded-ware horizon. These populations relied on mixed economies, combining limited agriculture with hunting and gathering. Settlement patterns were typically small and dispersed, with evidence of pit houses and timber frame structures suggesting both mobility and seasonal adaptation to the forest steppe environment. By the Bronze Age, approximately 2000 to 1000 BCE, new cultural horizons emerged, including the Triciniac and Srubna cultures. Excavations reveal fortified settlements, large burial mounds, and metalworking workshops. Archaeologists uncovered bronze tools, ornaments, and weapons, indicating growing social complexity and the presence of specialized craft production. Trade networks expanded during this period, as evidenced by the distribution of bronze artifacts from the Carpathians to the Volga, demonstrating early long-distance interaction. Climate and soil surveys suggest that fertile southern steppe regions supported intensive cereal cultivation, while northern forested areas relied on hunting, fishing, and foraging. During the Iron Age, from roughly 800 BCE to 500 CE, populations in Eastern Europe became increasingly sedentary and regionally differentiated. Archaeological assemblages show the development of fortified settlements along major river valleys, including the Dnieper and Desna. Material culture exhibits a mix of continuity with Bronze Age traditions and new influences from steppe nomads, such as Scythians and Sarmatians. Pottery styles, tool types, and burial practices provide evidence for both cultural transmission and local adaptation. Pollen analysis indicates expanded agricultural activity, including the cultivation of rye, barley, and millet, which supported denser populations. The transition from Iron Age communities to early Slavic culture is documented in the Prague-Korchak and Penkovka archaeological complexes, emerging around the 5th to 7th centuries CE. Excavations in these areas reveal small, open settlements, often consisting of rectangular dwellings with sunken floors, arranged in dispersed clusters along rivers and low-lying plains. Artifacts include handmade pottery, iron tools, and occasional imported goods, indicating participation in regional exchange networks. Burial customs shifted toward inhumation with minimal grave goods, reflecting changes in social organization and religious practices. The consistency in settlement layouts and material culture across a wide area suggests a degree of cultural cohesion among early Slavic groups. Archaeological surveys also demonstrate variability within early Slavic populations. Northern forested zones show a heavier reliance on hunting, fishing, and seasonal mobility, while southern forest steppe zones display more permanent agricultural settlements. Excavations at sites like Novoselki and Zarabinci reveal fortifications and evidence of collective labor, suggesting emerging forms of social organization capable of coordinating communal resources. Pottery styles, including stamped and incised decorations, serve as important chronological markers, enabling scholars to trace the spread and interaction of communities across the region. Records from neighboring civilizations, though limited, provide indirect evidence of these populations. Byzantine, Frankish, and Arabic sources occasionally reference Slavic groups, often in the context of raids or trade, indicating that external contacts intensified as these communities expanded. Archaeological finds of imported silver coins, beads, and metalwork confirm that early Slavs were integrated into broader Eurasian networks, participating in commerce that connected Northern Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and the steppe. The material record illustrates a pattern of gradual cultural development rather than abrupt transformation. Early Slavic society emerged through continuity with preceding Bronze and Iron Age traditions, selectively adopting innovations from neighboring peoples while maintaining local settlement strategies and subsistence practices. These patterns of habitation, production, and exchange laid the foundation for the demographic and political structures that would later facilitate the rise of the Rus principalities. By the end of the 5th century CE, these early Slavic communities had established a coherent presence across the forest steppe zone, marked by characteristic settlements, pottery, and burial practices. Their expansion along rivers and interaction with neighboring groups set the stage for increasing political integration and the emergence of more complex social hierarchies in subsequent centuries. By the 9th century, Scandinavian traders were embedded deep within Eastern Europe, navigating rivers that connected distant forests, steppe plains, and thriving trade centers, leaving behind traces of movement that survive in both artifacts and inscriptions. During this period, evidence indicates that Scandinavian groups, often referred to as Varangians in later sources, began to penetrate the river systems of Eastern Europe, particularly the Fokhov, Dnieper, and Upper Volga basins. Archaeological surveys of Ladoga and Novgorod reveal fortified settlements and burial mounds characteristic of Scandinavian material culture, including grave goods, weaponry, and distinctive brooches. Excavations at Staraya Ladoga, often identified as a key early Varangian hub, uncovered combs, iron tools, and imported artifacts from the Baltic region, confirming both movement and integration into local economic networks. Numismatic evidence supports these observations. Silver dirhams from the Islamic world have been found in Scandinavian-style graves, indicating the circulation of currency along trade routes linking Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and the Islamic Caliphates. Coins often appear alongside knives, swords, and shield fittings consistent with Scandinavian typologies, illustrating both martial and commercial activity. These finds suggest that Scandinavian groups were not only itinerant traders but also settlers who established semi-permanent communities within Slavic lands. Runic inscriptions provide additional insight into Varangian presence. Stone and bone inscriptions in the Ladoga region have been interpreted as markers of identity, commemorating individuals or recording short messages. The inscriptions confirm that these groups retained cultural continuity with Scandinavia, while simultaneously adapting to the environmental and social conditions of Eastern Europe. Their presence along key rivers allowed them to monitor trade, facilitate resource exchange, and exert influence over surrounding communities without immediately forming centralized polities. Archaeological patterns suggest that Scandinavian expansion was gradual and regionally selective. Sites along major rivers were preferred, allowing access to navigable waterways that facilitated both trade and raiding. Evidence from burial practices, including boat graves and furnished mounds, demonstrates a continuity with practices from Gotland and Uppland, indicating that these groups brought distinct cultural traditions while participating in local networks. Items such as swords with ring pommels, patterned bronze brooches, and imported glass beads illustrate the hybrid nature of material culture resulting from Varangian integration. Records from the primary chronicle, though compiled later, reference the arrival of Scandinavian leaders such as Rurik, highlighting a perception of external authority. While the chronicle must be approached cautiously, its narrative aligns with material evidence that northern groups had established footholds at strategic river nodes. Byzantine and Arabic travelers also occasionally mention northern traders navigating these rivers, corroborating archaeological interpretations of early Scandinavian activity in Eastern Europe. Settlement patterns indicate both temporary and permanent occupation. Some sites functioned primarily as trading outposts, supporting the exchange of furs, honey, and slaves for silver, textiles, and metalwork. Other sites evolved into more permanent settlements, featuring timber structures and defensive earthworks. Excavations in Novgorod reveal a stratified settlement with evidence of specialized craft production, including metalworking and woodworking, suggesting a level of socio-economic organization beyond mere transient trade. The Scandinavian presence did not occur in isolation. Early Slavic communities along the river networks were already well established, with agricultural villages and artisanal production. The Varangian settlements often overlapped or closely adjoined these Slavic villages, creating zones of interaction. Material culture demonstrates both cultural continuity and selective adoption, with Scandinavian-style items appearing in Slavic contexts, and local pottery or metalwork found within Varangian graves. This pattern indicates a dynamic process of integration, trade, and cultural exchange rather than unilateral domination. The environmental context of the rivers facilitated these interactions. Navigable waterways enabled long-distance travel, while seasonal flooding and ice conditions shaped settlement patterns. Archaeologists note that sites were typically positioned on elevated riverbanks or near fords, optimizing both trade access and defense. These logistical considerations highlight the strategic understanding of the region's geography by Scandinavian settlers. By the mid-9th century, Scandinavian traders and settlers had established a lasting presence in Eastern Europe, forming the initial framework for later political entities. Their settlements, material culture, and control of trade corridors would intersect with Slavic political structures, ultimately contributing to the emergence of the Rus polity. Archaeological and numismatic evidence thus provides a clear, verifiable record of Scandinavian integration into Eastern European society, setting the stage for dynastic and cultural developments that would follow in the coming centuries. The story of Rus begins not with certainty, but with a chronicle written centuries later, a text that shapes modern understanding even as it raises persistent questions about the earliest rulers and political structures. The primary chronicle, also known as the Tale of Bygone Years, is the principal written source for the formation of the early Rus polity. Compiled in the early 12th century, likely in Kiev under the supervision of monks associated with the local episcopacy, the chronicle presents a sequential narrative from the earliest settlement of Slavic lands through the reigns of the first Varangian princes. Its composition, over 2 centuries after the events it describes, creates both a valuable record and a historiographical challenge. The text blends oral tradition, monastic records, and political memory, requiring careful evaluation of its content against archaeological and external sources. The chronicle introduces Rurik as a Varangian leader invited to govern Novgorod, establishing a dynastic foundation for subsequent rulers. According to the narrative, Rurik's arrival and the subsequent settlement of his followers set the stage for the unification of neighboring Slavic communities under centralized authority. While the historicity of Rurik is debated, material evidence, including Scandinavian-style burials and fortified settlements in Ladoga and Novgorod, supports the presence of northern elites in these regions during the 9th century. These finds suggest that the chronicle, though compiled later, reflects an underlying historical reality of Scandinavian integration and political influence. The text's treatment of succession, alliances, and territorial expansion demonstrates a retrospective effort to legitimize ruling dynasties. Scholars note that events, names, and chronologies are often compressed or restructured to create a coherent narrative, blending fact with monastic interpretation. Byzantine accounts of northern traders and raiders provide external corroboration for some elements, though these sources emphasize commercial activity and occasional military engagements rather than dynastic settlement. Numismatic evidence, including Islamic dirhams found at riverine trading sites, further indicates northern presence contemporaneous with the chronicle's early events. Critical evaluation of the primary chronicle requires distinguishing its ideological and literary purposes from verifiable events. Archaeological data confirms settlement continuity along river corridors but does not uniformly corroborate specific leaders or episodes. For instance, references to the establishment of Kiev as a political center align broadly with dendrochronology and stratigraphic studies, which date urban occupation and fortification to the late 9th century. In contrast, Rurik's personal actions remain less certain. Historians emphasize the need to treat the chronicle as a source that reflects collective memory, political ideology, and ecclesiastical priorities, rather than a strictly factual account. The chronicle also situates early Rus within broader European and Byzantine contexts, noting tribute arrangements, treaties, and raids. These elements illustrate an awareness of interaction networks extending from Scandinavia through Eastern Europe to the Black Sea. Archaeological confirmation of imported goods, including Byzantine coins, jewelry, and luxury items, demonstrates that the settlements described in the text were part of active economic systems, even if individual episodes were embellished or reordered. Such convergence between textual and material evidence enables scholars to reconstruct probable sequences of events while maintaining a critical perspective. Despite these limitations, the primary chronicle provides a framework for understanding the emergence of early Rus political structures. The narrative emphasizes the consolidation of disparate communities under ruling elites, the strategic importance of river corridors, and the integration of Slavic and Scandinavian elements into nascent governance. Material culture, including timber fortifications, household artifacts, and grave goods, substantiates the presence of hierarchical organization consistent with the chronicle's description of princely authority, even if specific attributions remain uncertain. Furthermore, the chronicle's discussion of dynastic practices highlights early succession patterns and the distribution of power among regional elites. Archaeological and settlement evidence supports a model in which riverine hubs facilitated coordination across dispersed communities. These hubs allowed emerging authorities to exercise influence over trade, tribute collection, and defense, confirming the plausibility of political consolidation described in the textual record. By the mid-9th century, a combination of Scandinavian migration, Slavic settlement, and strategic riverine positioning laid the foundation for centralized authority in the region. While the primary chronicle must be approached critically, it remains indispensable for tracing the origins of Rus identity, linking archaeological and numismatic evidence to the broader historical narrative. Despite chronological uncertainties and literary biases, the convergence of material and textual sources demonstrates that the early Rus polity emerged rapidly along key trade routes and settlement nodes. With Kiev's capture, the Rus entered written history as a state, transitioning from a collection of riverine settlements into a cohesive political entity capable of engaging with distant empires. By the late 9th century, the emerging Rus polity had consolidated power along the principal rivers of Eastern Europe, linking Novgorod in the north to key southern territories. According to the primary chronicle, Oleg, a Varangian military leader and regent of the young Prince Igor, orchestrated the seizure of Kiev in 882 CE. The chronicle describes a campaign in which Oleg moved southward along the Dnieper River, asserting control over the city and integrating surrounding Slavic settlements into a unified administration. While the narrative must be critically evaluated, archaeological evidence, including timber fortifications, early urban layouts, and imported goods, corroborates a surge in centralized activity in Kiev during this period. Kiev's location at the convergence of river routes connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea and linking the interior forest steppe to the steppe frontiers provided strategic and economic advantages. Archaeological excavations indicate that the city had access to fertile land suitable for subsistence agriculture, while its proximity to the Dnieper enabled trade and tribute collection. The city's defensive structures, including earthworks and palisades, reveal both preparation for potential conflict and an investment in political permanence. These developments transformed Kiev from a regional settlement into a hub capable of projecting authority across neighboring principalities. The unification under Oleg allowed for the establishment of organized tribute collection, which formed the basis of the Rus' early fiscal system. Tributes, or poliody, involved local Slavic communities providing agricultural produce, furs, and other resources to the central authority. Records in the primary chronicle describe Oleg's regulation of these contributions, suggesting a systematic approach to governance that strengthened princely power while ensuring a degree of regional stability. Archaeological evidence of storage pits, fortified settlements, and trade goods supports the existence of coordinated economic systems accompanying political centralization. Military organization was integral to the consolidation of Kiev. Oleg reportedly commanded a retinue of Varangian warriors, whose mobility along rivers allowed for rapid response to rebellion or external threats. Graves and weapon deposits in northern and central settlements reveal a mix of Scandinavian and Slavic martial technology, indicating integration of diverse forces under emerging political authority. The combination of permanent fortifications and mobile military units allowed Oleg to maintain control over dispersed communities along riverine corridors. Kiev's unification also facilitated diplomatic engagement with neighboring powers, most notably the Byzantine Empire. Treaties recorded in later chronicles describe agreements regarding trade, tribute, and military cooperation. While specific texts of these treaties are not extant, contemporary Byzantine records reference Rus delegations along the Black Sea, confirming interaction between Kiev and Constantinople. Archaeological finds of Byzantine coins, luxury goods, and amphorae in Kiev and along the Dnieper indicate active commerce and diplomatic exchange, reflecting the city's integration into wider political networks. The establishment of Kiev as a political center encouraged the growth of urban infrastructure. Excavations reveal timber dwellings, craft workshops, and marketplaces consistent with the city transitioning from a fortified settlement to an administrative hub. Imported goods from Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world appear alongside local production, demonstrating the city's centrality in regional trade and its capacity to sustain both elite and non-elite populations. Settlement density along the Dnieper and adjacent tributaries increased significantly during this period, reflecting both the strategic value of Kiev and its growing economic influence. Historiographically, Oleg's campaign and the unification of Kiev illustrate the convergence of Scandinavian leadership and Slavic settlement structures. The chronicle emphasizes Oleg as a decisive figure, but material evidence indicates that political cohesion relied on pre-existing networks of fortified settlements, agricultural villages, and river trade. This combination of imported leadership and local infrastructure underscores the pragmatic nature of early state formation, integrating diverse communities under centralized administration without displacing existing socio-economic practices. By consolidating Kiev and establishing organized tribute, military presence, and trade connections, Oleg laid the foundation for the Kievan state. The city's central position allowed subsequent rulers to extend authority over surrounding principalities, formalize governance practices, and interact with regional powers. Archaeological and textual evidence together demonstrate that Kiev's transformation was not instantaneous but the result of deliberate administrative, economic, and military organization, confirming the emergence of Rus as a coherent political entity. Political unity, however, was only the first step. Establishing authority over a geographically and culturally diverse territory required institutional mechanisms to manage succession, law, and tribute. The unification of Kiev marked the beginning of a structured polity capable of enduring beyond a single ruler's lifetime, but its continued stability depended on the development of governance, legal frameworks, and centralized administration. These foundational elements set the stage for subsequent consolidation, including codification of law, Christianization, and expansion of Kievan influence throughout Eastern Europe. Rule in Rus relied on negotiation as much as force, with authority exercised through a combination of personal leadership, customary obligations, and emerging legal frameworks. Following the unification of Kiev under Oleg, early Rus governance developed along river corridors, integrating both Scandinavian leadership structures and Slavic communal practices. Princely authority centered on the prince, who commanded loyalty through a retinue known as the Druzina. This group of armed followers served not only as a military force but also as an administrative instrument, collecting tribute, enforcing agreements, and mediating disputes among subordinate communities. Archaeological excavations of fortified settlements and weapon caches corroborate the presence of organized military administrative structures supporting princely authority. One of the central mechanisms of early governance was the tribute system or polyuti. Under this arrangement, the prince and his retinue traveled along river routes to collect resources, including agricultural produce, furs, and crafted goods, from surrounding settlements. The system relied on established agreements and reciprocal obligations rather than coercion alone. Textual references in the primary chronicle indicate that tribute collection was often negotiated with local leaders, and mismanagement could provoke resistance or rebellion. Archaeological evidence, including storage pits and standardized hoards of goods, suggests a degree of administrative regularity, indicating that the collection and redistribution of tribute were increasingly formalized. Princely authority extended into judicial functions. The earliest legal norms were a combination of customary Slavic practices and emerging codified regulations. Dispute resolution often involved local assemblies or vesh, where male members of the community could deliberate on matters ranging from property claims to interpersonal conflicts. The prince and his retinue acted as arbitrators, enforcing decisions and, when necessary, imposing penalties. Material evidence, such as inscriptions on boundary markers and communal enclosures, demonstrates the presence of regulated property rights and coordinated communal obligations, which were enforced under princely oversight. The integration of trade networks also influenced governance. Cities like Kiev and Novgorod became hubs for economic exchange, and effective administration required monitoring of market activity, taxation, and transit of goods. Archaeological finds, including scales, weights, and imported coinage, indicate that oversight of commercial activity was a recognized responsibility of early rulers. This combination of military presence, tribute collection, and economic regulation established the foundation for a centralized, yet flexible, system of authority. Military organization was closely tied to governance. The Druzina performed policing functions within settlements, provided security along trade routes, and accompanied the prince during expeditions to enforce tribute obligations. Burial evidence, including weaponry in graves and fortified dwellings, confirms the dual role of these groups as both enforcers and administrative agents. Their loyalty was maintained through a combination of material reward, social status, and negotiated obligation, highlighting the interplay between coercion and consent in early Rus governance. Codification of law during this period was limited but evolving. Customary rules governed inheritance, property disputes, and interpersonal conduct, while the prince's decisions set precedents that gradually became recognized norms. The Ruskaya Pravda, codified under Yaroslav the Wise in the early 11th century, would later formalize these practices, but its origins reflect incremental institutional development beginning with Oleg and his successors. Archaeological evidence, including boundary markers and communal storage systems, demonstrates the practical application of these norms in regulating social and economic activity. Interaction with external powers also shaped governance. Treaties with Byzantium and the presence of Scandinavian traders required oversight and negotiation. Envoys and merchant intermediaries facilitated agreements, while the prince ensured compliance through both diplomacy and the threat of force. Numismatic evidence, including Byzantine and Islamic coins, demonstrates that early Rus authorities engaged in complex economic and political networks, balancing internal administration with external relations. The geographic realities of the river system reinforced these governance structures. Principalities were organized along navigable waterways, enabling the prince and his retinue to travel efficiently for both tribute collection and conflict resolution. Settlements located along rivers were integrated into a hierarchy of authority, with urban centers like Kiev serving as nodes of administration, law enforcement, and military coordination. Archaeological surveys reveal a pattern of fortified settlements along key tributaries, supporting centralized oversight while accommodating dispersed populations. By integrating military, fiscal, and legal functions, early Rus governance established a model capable of maintaining cohesion across diverse territories. Authority was exercised through negotiation, customary law, and strategic application of force, reflecting a balance between centralized leadership and local autonomy. Tributes, judicial oversight, and military organization combined to create an administrative system that could adapt to both geographic and social constraints. Governance evolved alongside belief systems, as religious practices and emerging ecclesiastical influence would later formalize authority and codify law. The integration of ritual observance, community consensus, and princely leadership established the institutional foundations that allowed the Rus state to consolidate power, administer justice, and interact with neighboring polities. This period demonstrates the pragmatic, systemic nature of early governance, setting the stage for legal codification, Christianization, and the cultural maturation of Kievan Rus. Before Christianity, Rus society was bound by ritual and seasonal worship, structured around a pantheon of deities and practices that reflected both the rhythms of nature and the needs of early communities. The religious landscape of early Slavic populations in the forest steppe region was complex and regionally diverse, combining animistic, polytheistic, and ancestor-focused elements. Archaeological evidence, including sacred groves, wooden idols, and ritual deposits, indicates that spiritual practice was closely integrated with daily life. These sites, often located near rivers, groves, or elevated terrain, served as focal points for community gatherings, seasonal celebrations, and offerings intended to ensure agricultural fertility, communal protection, and success in hunting or warfare. The pantheon of Slavic deities included both major gods and localized spirits. Evidence from later texts and comparative ethnographic studies suggests the worship of Purin, the god of thunder and war, Velis, associated with cattle, wealth, and the underworld, and Mokosh, a goddess linked to fertility and domestic tasks. While no contemporary written Slavic accounts survive from the pre-Christian period, the distribution of votive objects, sacrificial pits, and ritual figurines allow scholars to reconstruct patterns of worship. For example, excavations near Smolensk and Kiev reveal deposits of animal bones and pottery fragments in shallow pits, consistent with seasonal sacrificial rites intended to secure protection or prosperity. Settlement patterns further reflect ritual practices. Communities often oriented dwellings and public spaces in relation to sacred sites, and archaeological surveys indicate that ritual areas were deliberately separated from ordinary domestic areas, reinforcing social and spiritual hierarchies. The use of natural features, such as rivers and groves, as ritual sites suggests a cosmology in which the landscape itself was imbued with spiritual significance, providing both communal cohesion and a framework for interpreting environmental cycles. Material culture demonstrates both symbolic and practical elements of religious practice. Artifacts such as figurines, amulets, and carved wooden stelae reflect a belief in protective spirits and divine intermediaries. Archaeologists have identified items shaped as animals or anthropomorphic figures, which may have served as talismans or offerings. Some burial sites from this period include ritual objects alongside the deceased, indicating that religious observance extended into funerary practice and provided a structured framework for understanding life, death, and ancestry. Ritual calendars were closely tied to subsistence cycles. Seasonal ceremonies marked planting and harvest periods, as well as solar and lunar transitions, which were critical in an agrarian society. Evidence from pollen studies, coupled with archaeological features like fire pits and enclosures, suggests that communal gatherings for feasting and offerings occurred in synchronization with these cycles. Such practices reinforced community identity, ensured cooperation in resource management, and structured social obligations around shared religious observance. The role of intermediaries or spiritual specialists is suggested by both settlement patterns and artifact distribution. Certain sites contain concentrations of ritual items or elevated platforms, which may indicate the presence of figures responsible for performing ceremonies, mediating disputes, or interpreting omens. These specialists likely played a dual role, combining spiritual authority with social and political influence, thereby integrating religious practice into the broader governance of early Slavic communities. Interactions with neighboring cultures also influenced early religious practice. Trade networks and occasional conflict with steppe nomads, Scandinavian settlers, and Byzantine intermediaries exposed Slavic populations to alternative beliefs. While archaeological evidence shows persistence of local deities and rituals, imported items such as foreign amulets or coins in ritual deposits suggest that early Rus religious practice was neither static nor isolated, but dynamically responsive to broader cultural currents. Records from later Christian chroniclers, though written post-conversion, provide corroborative details about pre-Christian practices. They describe temples, idol worship, and sacred groves, echoing archaeological evidence of communal ritual spaces. These sources indicate that religious practice was embedded in civic life, influencing leadership decisions, conflict resolution, and societal norms, and that spiritual authority operated in parallel with emerging political structures. By the late 9th century, Slavic paganism provided both social cohesion and a framework for interaction with external actors. Sacred spaces, seasonal rituals, and deity veneration structured daily life and underpinned early governance, while facilitating trade, conflict resolution, and community integration. The pervasive influence of ritual ensured that early Rus society was organized around spiritual as well as practical concerns, creating a complex cultural matrix. External religions soon challenged this system, particularly as trade networks expanded and contact with Byzantium, Scandinavia, and Islamic regions increased. Exposure to new faiths, combined with political considerations, laid the groundwork for the adoption of Christianity in the following century, initiating a transformative shift in religious, cultural, and legal frameworks. Belief followed commerce into Rus lands, as rivers that carried furs and silver also introduced new ideas, texts, and religious practices from distant civilizations. The expansion of trade networks in the 8th and 9th centuries facilitated exposure to diverse religious traditions. Eastern European rivers, the Dnieper, Volga, and Don, linked Rus settlements to the Islamic world, Byzantium, and Jewish communities along Black Sea ports and the Caspian corridor. Archaeological evidence from Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kiev demonstrates the circulation of Islamic silver dirhams, glassware, and jewelry, indicating both economic and cultural exchange. These artifacts suggest that Rus traders and elites were familiar with Islamic beliefs and practices, even if direct religious adoption remained limited during the pre-Christian period. Jewish communities, particularly in Byzantine and Khazar-controlled regions, provided additional points of contact. While direct evidence of Jewish settlement in early Rus is scarce, chronicles and trade records indicate interaction through commerce and diplomacy. Rus merchants would have encountered Jewish intermediaries along trade routes, facilitating knowledge of religious customs, literacy, and legal traditions. Items such as imported coins with Hebrew inscriptions or weights marked according to Jewish standards illustrate these indirect influences on Rus economic and cultural practices. Christianity, particularly Byzantine Orthodox Christianity, exerted the most significant long-term impact. Rus contact with Byzantium intensified through both trade and diplomatic missions. Archaeological excavations along the Dnieper River reveal imported Christian artifacts, including icons, reliquaries, and metalwork, predating the formal conversion in the late 10th century. These objects suggest familiarity with Christian symbols and ritual practices among elite groups, indicating gradual exposure before official adoption. Byzantine texts describe delegations from Rus leaders visiting Constantinople, reflecting both political interest and curiosity about Christian governance and ecclesiastical organization. Trade-driven exposure was complemented by military and diplomatic encounters. Rus raids along the Black Sea brought northern communities into direct contact with Christian cities and monasteries, while treaties required negotiation with Byzantine authorities. These interactions transmitted not only material goods but also religious knowledge, administrative practices, and literacy in Greek. Numismatic evidence supports this exchange, with Byzantine coins and seals found at key riverine settlements, underscoring the dual economic and ideological influence of Byzantium. Despite the presence of multiple faiths, the adoption of religion in Rus was selective and politically motivated. Early Rus elites engaged with Islamic, Jewish, and Christian ideas as part of broader strategies to secure trade, alliance, and legitimacy. Material and textual evidence indicates that exposure to these religions informed social and legal practices, such as tribute collection, judicial norms, and diplomatic protocols, even before any single faith became dominant. Artifacts from urban centers show a blend of symbolic motifs, reflecting a transitional period of religious pluralism and cultural negotiation. Chronicles suggest that Christian influence grew steadily among elite groups prior to official conversion. Reports of bishops, clerics, and missionary activity, while not contemporaneous with archaeological evidence, corroborate the presence of Christian ideas circulating through trade and diplomacy. Items such as early Byzantine crosses and liturgical objects found in Kiev, Novgorod, and Ladoga reveal that Christian material culture preceded formal institutional adoption, creating familiarity that facilitated eventual state conversion. By the 10th century, this exposure set the stage for the adoption of a single dominant faith. While Islamic and Jewish contacts influenced commerce, law, and cultural knowledge, the organizational and ideological framework of Byzantine Christianity offered a model for political consolidation, literacy, and ritual authority that aligned with Rus' emerging state structures. Archaeological, numismatic and textual evidence collectively demonstrates that trade and diplomacy were instrumental in transmitting religious ideas, preparing the social and political context for the formal conversion of Kiev under Vladimir in 988 CE. One faith would ultimately prevail, not solely through spiritual appeal, but through strategic alignment with governance, law, and international relations. The gradual penetration of religious influence highlights how commerce, diplomacy, and elite choice interacted to reshape the spiritual landscape of early Rus, laying the foundation for the centralization of belief and the integration of ecclesiastical authority into the emerging Kievan state in 988. Rus chose a new spiritual direction, aligning its political, cultural, and religious trajectory with the Byzantine world through the formal adoption of Orthodox Christianity. The decision of Prince Vladimir of Kiev to convert and impose Christianity across his realm represents one of the most consequential moments in Eastern European history. Sources such as the Primary Chronicle provide narrative accounts of the selection and baptism of Vladimir, linking his political ambitions to religious legitimacy. Although the chronicle was compiled over a century after the event, its description aligns with archaeological and Byzantine textual evidence, offering insight into both the context and implications of the conversion. Vladimir's conversion was not solely a personal religious act but a deliberate political strategy. By choosing Byzantine Christianity, he established a formal alliance with Constantinople, gaining both diplomatic recognition and access to the administrative, cultural, and economic resources of the Byzantine Empire. Marriage alliances, notably Vladimir's marriage to Anna, sister of Emperor Basil II, cemented these connections, creating ties that reinforced dynastic legitimacy and integrated Rus into wider Eurasian networks. Byzantine chronicles, including accounts from Leo the Deacon and John Skylitzes, confirm both the marriage and the accompanying political arrangements, indicating that religion and diplomacy were intertwined. Archaeological evidence corroborates the chronicle's account of Christian adoption. Excavations in Kiev reveal the construction of early churches and ecclesiastical complexes contemporaneous with Vladimir's reign. Foundations at the site of the Church of the Tithes, Desyatina Church, indicate large-scale stone architecture and imported Byzantine materials, including mosaics, ceramics, and metalwork, reflecting both religious and cultural transfer. Burial practices also began to shift, with Christian inhumation gradually replacing earlier pagan rites, indicating societal adherence to new religious norms. The choice of Byzantine orthodoxy over alternative faiths was influenced by multiple factors. Islam, while familiar through trade networks, imposed prohibitions on alcohol and certain economic practices, which may have conflicted with Rus societal norms. Western Latin Christianity lacked the cultural and political compatibility offered by Byzantium, particularly regarding trade access and recognition of princely authority. Byzantine orthodoxy provided a model that integrated ecclesiastical hierarchy with imperial precedent, offering both spiritual guidance and political legitimacy in one framework. Vladimir's conversion involved both personal baptism and a broader program of Christianization across his realm. The Primary Chronicle recounts the mass baptism of Kiev's inhabitants in the Dnieper River, symbolizing both a religious and political unification. While the exact scale and method remain debated, archaeological evidence supports rapid ecclesiastical development, including churches in urban centers and Christianized burial sites. The dissemination of liturgical objects, crosses, and imported icons demonstrates that elite endorsement was complemented by material support for institutional religion. The political implications of conversion were profound. Alignment with Byzantium enhanced Rus authority in regional affairs, facilitating trade along the Black Sea and integrating Kiev into Eastern Mediterranean diplomatic networks. Byzantine clergy and artisans brought administrative knowledge, literacy, and ceremonial expertise, enabling the prince to consolidate governance and establish institutional frameworks for taxation, justice, and local administration. Written legal and religious codes, emerging in the following decades, reflect the synthesis of imported ecclesiastical practice and local governance. Cultural transformation extended beyond religion into art, architecture, and literacy. Byzantine influence introduced iconography, monumental church construction, and decorative arts, evidenced by imported mosaics, frescoes, and reliquaries found in Kiev and Novgorod. Literacy in Old Church Slavonic spread alongside clerical training, facilitating both liturgical practice and the recording of history, law, and commerce. These developments marked the beginning of an enduring Byzantine cultural imprint that shaped Rus' identity for centuries. Christianization also altered social structures. Priestly hierarchies provided a new framework for communal authority, while ritual practices structured seasonal, civic, and familial life. Pagan institutions and cultic sites were gradually supplanted or repurposed, reflecting both elite control and community participation. Archaeological analysis of ritual deposits and early church precincts shows evidence of adaptation rather than abrupt eradication, illustrating a transitional period in which religious authority was negotiated and gradually institutionalized. Resistance to conversion appears to have been limited but persistent in peripheral areas. Archaeological evidence of continued pagan practice, particularly in rural settlements, indicates that Christianization was uneven and implemented progressively. Elite enforcement, combined with social incentives such as inclusion in trade networks and administrative roles, facilitated broader adoption while accommodating local traditions. By the early 11th century, however, Christianity had become the dominant religious framework in Kiev and surrounding principalities, reshaping both spiritual life and state institutions. By the end of Vladimir's reign, Rus had entered a new era defined by institutionalized religion, political alignment with Byzantium, and integration into a broader cultural and diplomatic sphere. The conversion provided legitimacy for princely authority, strengthened dynastic alliances, and introduced frameworks for literacy, law, and ritual organization. Archaeological, numismatic, and textual evidence collectively demonstrate that the 988 baptism was both a religious and political milestone, setting the foundation for the cultural transformation and state consolidation that would characterize Kievan Rus in the centuries that followed. The adoption of Byzantine Christianity initiated a chain of institutional and cultural changes, affecting governance, law, education, and art. Conversion reshaped not only spiritual life but also the mechanisms of state administration, diplomacy, and social cohesion, establishing structures that would endure throughout the medieval period. The alignment of faith and authority allowed Kievan Rus to emerge as a recognized and influential polity within the Eastern European and Mediterranean world. Christianity reordered Rus society, introducing literacy, formal legal structures, and an institutional framework that transformed governance, culture, and civic life. The adoption of Byzantine orthodoxy under Vladimir initiated a systematic process of ecclesiastical organization throughout Kievan Rus. Churches and monasteries became central to both religious practice and political administration. Archaeological evidence, particularly the foundations of stone churches in Kiev and Novgorod, reveals large-scale construction projects undertaken with Byzantine architectural models, including cross-and-square layouts, imported mosaics, and decorative metalwork. These ecclesiastical centers not only served spiritual functions but also became hubs for education, record-keeping, and legal adjudication, bridging the gap between religious and civic authority. Literacy spread rapidly through these institutions, facilitated by the introduction of the Cyrillic script, developed by Saints Cyril and Methodius and adapted for Slavic languages. Manuscripts, inscriptions, and liturgical texts indicate that clerics trained in scriptoria were responsible for copying religious and administrative documents, maintaining records of donations, tributes, and legal decrees. Archaeological evidence from Novgorod and Kiev includes inscribed birchbark letters and fragments of parchment, demonstrating early Slavic literacy outside strictly monastic contexts and illustrating the integration of written communication into everyday governance. Ecclesiastical courts emerged as a crucial mechanism for law and social regulation. Bishops and priests adjudicated disputes, enforced canon law, and mediated conflicts between individuals and communities. The fusion of religious and secular authority allowed for greater cohesion across Kievan Rus' diverse territories. Material evidence, such as boundary markers, inscriptions, and standardized property divisions, supports the operation of structured legal oversight in urban and rural settlements. Legal codification, which would later culminate in the Russkaya Pravda, drew upon both customary practices and the administrative expertise introduced by Byzantine clergy, creating an enduring system of norms that blended indigenous and imported elements. The introduction of literacy and written law facilitated administrative efficiency. taxation records, tribute lists, and correspondence between princely authorities and the church required standardized documentation. Archaeological evidence of storage facilities, coins, and weights underscores the practical application of written administration in managing trade, resource collection, and civic obligations. Literacy thus extended beyond religious practice, underpinning economic, legal, and political functions within the Kievan state. Christianization also structured social hierarchy and civic identity. The Church provided a moral framework, sanctioned authority, and legitimized dynastic rule. Ecclesiastical endorsement of princely decisions reinforced central authority and offered a mechanism for conflict resolution. Architectural prominence of churches in urban centers signaled both spiritual and political power, while ritual practices such as baptism and annual feasts integrated Christian observance into communal life, aligning societal norms with Byzantine models. Education and clerical training were instrumental in disseminating literacy and religious knowledge. Monastic schools taught reading, writing, liturgical recitation, and theological doctrine, producing clerics capable of administering ecclesiastical courts and maintaining records. Archaeological evidence of monastic complexes, manuscript fragments, and writing implements indicates that such institutions were distributed across key urban centers, including Kiev, Novgorod, and Chernihiv, ensuring regional consistency in religious practice and legal administration. Trade and cultural exchange further reinforced ecclesiastical influence. Interaction with Byzantium provided not only religious texts and clerical personnel, but also material culture, including icons, reliquaries, and liturgical vessels. These objects served both devotional and propagandistic functions, visually communicating authority, legitimacy, and continuity with the broader Orthodox world. Numismatic evidence, such as Byzantine coins found in Rus settlements, underscores the intertwined nature of commerce, religion, and governance during this period. Christianization reshaped funerary practices, reflecting both legal and spiritual dimensions. Burial customs transitioned from inhumation with pagan offerings to standardized rites with crosses and church-sanctioned orientation. Archaeological analysis of cemeteries in Kiev, Novgorod, and surrounding regions confirms the integration of Christian ritual into daily life, reinforcing social order and institutional authority. The spread of Christian norms created a coherent cultural framework, facilitating enforcement of law and alignment of community practices with centralized governance. By the mid-11th century, ecclesiastical structures, literacy, and legal codification had transformed the fabric of Rus society. Christian institutions enabled princes to consolidate authority, standardize tribute and judicial practices, and integrate distant communities into a coherent state. The combination of written law, clerical oversight, and religious ritual created enduring mechanisms for governance and cultural cohesion, establishing a template for civic life that would persist throughout the medieval period. Cultural alignment with Byzantium, achieved through literacy, law, and church organization, set the stage for expansion. Christian institutions provided both ideological and administrative frameworks, allowing Kievan Rus to project authority beyond local centers and integrate new territories into the state apparatus. The confluence of religious observance, legal codification, and literacy enabled the principality to coordinate economic, diplomatic, and military initiatives across its extensive riverine networks, laying the foundation for the Rus emergence as a major political and cultural power in Eastern Europe. Rus prosperity flowed along rivers, linking distant forests, steppe regions, and the Black Sea in networks of exchange that underpinned political and urban development. From the 9th century onward, riverine trade networks served as the lifeblood of Kievan Rus. The Dnieper, Volga, and western Dvina rivers provided navigable corridors connecting the northern forests to the Black Sea, the Caspian, and the Baltic. Archaeological evidence, including hoards of silver dirhams, Byzantine coins, and weights for trade, demonstrates that these waterways facilitated long-distance commerce. Settlement patterns along these rivers reveal clustering of fortified towns, marketplaces, and storage facilities, underscoring the economic centrality of river routes to early Rus prosperity. Fur was a primary commodity, harvested from the extensive forests of northern and central Rus. Archaeological analysis of trapping tools, animal remains, and trade records indicates organized collection and long-distance distribution. Elite households often controlled fur resources, exchanging pelts for silver, textiles, and luxury goods imported from Byzantium and the Islamic world. Furs not only generated wealth but also reinforced social hierarchies, as possession of high-quality pelts signaled status and facilitated political alliances. Slaves constituted another significant aspect of the Rus economy. Chronicles and Byzantine sources describe the sale of captives to southern markets, particularly Constantinople and the Islamic Caliphates. Archaeological evidence, including fortified settlements and inscriptions, suggests that captives were often integrated into labor systems, contributing to construction, agriculture, or craft production prior to sale. The regulation and collection of tribute, which occasionally included slaves, provided a structured mechanism for incorporating human resources into the economic system. Agricultural goods were vital for both subsistence and trade. Archaeobotanical studies indicate cultivation of rye, wheat, barley, and legumes across southern Rus, while animal husbandry supplemented these staples with cattle, sheep, and pigs. Riverine transport enabled surplus production to reach urban centers and external markets, connecting rural communities to broader economic networks. Storage pits, granaries, and transport vessels uncovered in Kiev and Novgorod illustrate systematic collection and movement of agricultural commodities. Silver and coinage circulated extensively, facilitating commercial transactions and tribute payments. Hoards of Islamic dirhams, Byzantine coins, and later Kievan issues demonstrate integration into trans-regional monetary systems. The concentration of silver in riverine settlements supports the interpretation that currency was both a medium of exchange and a symbol of elite authority, enabling princely oversight and regulation of trade networks. Urban centers functioned as hubs for these exchanges. Kiev, Novgorod, Chernihiv, and Smolensk developed marketplaces where imported luxury goods, raw materials, and locally produced items converged. Archaeological evidence of workshops, forges, and craft districts demonstrates specialized production, including metalwork, pottery, textiles, and woodworking, supporting both local consumption and export. Trade facilitated not only economic growth but also cultural and technological exchange, integrating Rus into broader Eurasian networks. The diversity of traded commodities reflects both environmental adaptation and social demand. Northern forests provided furs and timber, southern plains supported agriculture, and river systems enabled movement of metals, ceramics, and luxury goods. Trade routes connected Rus to Byzantium, the Islamic world, Scandinavia, and Central Europe, creating a dynamic economic landscape where local production interacted with imported materials and ideas. Control over these trade networks reinforced political authority. Princely oversight ensured security along river routes, regulated tolls, and adjudicated disputes between merchants and communities. Archaeological evidence, including fortified river crossings, warehouses, and strategic settlement placement, supports the assertion that economic control was a key element of early state consolidation. Coordination of trade, tribute, and taxation allowed rulers to mobilize resources for military campaigns, urban construction, and administrative expansion. By the 10th century, these trade networks had not only generated wealth but also facilitated cultural transmission. Imported coins, textiles, religious artifacts, and luxury goods contributed to the material and ideological integration of Rus with surrounding polities. The circulation of ideas, technology, and artistic motifs reinforced political and religious alignment, complementing ecclesiastical influence and literacy initiatives initiated under Vladimir and his successors. Trade also influenced social organization. Merchants, artisans, and specialized laborers gained prominence, shaping urban hierarchy and contributing to the formation of civic institutions. Evidence from craft workshops, inscriptions, and commercial hoards demonstrates that urban communities were structured to accommodate both production and exchange, reflecting the interdependence of economic activity and social cohesion. The significance of river trade extended beyond material wealth. By connecting dispersed settlements, it facilitated administrative coordination, political centralization, and cultural homogenization. Networks linking Kiev, Novgorod, and peripheral towns created a system in which resources, labor, and information flowed efficiently, underpinning the economic and political foundations of the Kievan state. The integration of local production, imported goods, and long-distance exchange illustrates how commerce was inseparable from governance, social order, and cultural development. Trade supported urban growth, not only through wealth accumulation but also by promoting settlement concentration and infrastructural development. Fortified towns, marketplaces, craft districts, and storage facilities emerged along rivers as nodes of production, administration, and exchange. The convergence of resources, labor, and political oversight along these waterways ensured that the economic foundation of Rus sustained both daily life and state-building efforts, laying the groundwork for the expansion of Kievan influence across Eastern Europe. Cities became engines of power, concentrating wealth, labor, and political authority along strategic river corridors. By the 10th century, urban centers in Kievan Rus had evolved beyond fortified settlements into complex hubs of administration, production, and commerce. Archaeological surveys of Kiev, Novgorod, Chernihiv, and Smolensk reveal evidence of stratified urban landscapes, where elite residences, religious complexes, workshops, and marketplaces were spatially organized to support both governance and economic activity. Timber fortifications and earthen ramparts delineated defensive zones, while the interior of towns was divided into quarters reflecting social function, occupational specialization, and proximity to central authority. Social stratification within these cities was both functional and symbolic. Princely families and their retinues, including the Druzina, occupied fortified compounds, often adjacent to administrative buildings and churches. These elites controlled tribute collection, trade regulation, and military mobilization. Archaeological evidence, including large timber halls, imported luxury goods, and specialized craft items, indicates concentrated wealth and access to transregional networks, highlighting the link between political authority and urban habitation. Beneath the elite, specialized craftspeople formed the backbone of urban economies. Workshops for metalworking, pottery, textiles, and woodworking are identified across excavated sites. Tools, molds, kilns, and slag deposits provide material evidence of organized production, often coordinated for both local consumption and long-distance trade. The distribution of craft districts suggests deliberate urban planning, with certain quarters devoted to specific trades, reflecting both efficiency and regulation. Guild-like arrangements likely governed quality control, apprenticeship, and resource allocation, reinforcing social hierarchy while sustaining economic productivity. Merchants occupied a distinct position within urban society, bridging local production and long-distance commerce. Marketplaces, often situated near river ports, facilitated the exchange of fur, grain, silver, and imported goods such as Byzantine jewelry and Islamic coins. Inscriptions, weights, and standardized storage facilities indicate that commerce was regulated, ensuring both taxation and stability. Merchant families could accrue considerable wealth and influence, integrating them into broader networks of political negotiation and civic oversight. Religious institutions were central to urban social structure. Churches and monasteries not only provided spiritual guidance but also functioned as centers of education, literacy, and legal mediation. Clergy participated in adjudicating disputes, administering charitable support, and maintaining records of land ownership and donations. The proximity of ecclesiastical complexes to princely compounds underscores the interdependence of political and religious authority, with spatial arrangement reflecting both hierarchy and governance. Residential patterns within cities reveal additional layers of social differentiation. Archaeological analysis shows variation in house size, construction quality, and artifact assemblages, indicating that economic status, occupational role, and access to imported goods shaped domestic environments. Smaller dwellings for craftspeople and laborers were interspersed with larger elite residences, creating a mosaic of urban function and social stratification. Streets and pathways connecting these quarters suggest deliberate planning to facilitate both movement and oversight. The concentration of population in cities enabled centralized administration of tribute, labor, and defense. Princely oversight of urban settlements allowed for coordination of craft production, market regulation, and mobilization of military forces. Archaeological evidence of fortified river crossings, watchtowers, and defensive walls illustrates the integration of security measures into urban design, ensuring protection of both economic resources and political authority. Urban centers also served as cultural and technological nodes. Imported objects, including Byzantine and Islamic ceramics, metalwork, and textiles, circulated alongside locally produced goods. Craft specialists adapted foreign techniques to local materials, creating hybridized products that reflected both innovation and continuity. Workshops and markets became venues for skill transmission, economic negotiation, and social interaction, reinforcing communal cohesion and elite oversight simultaneously. Social organization within cities was dynamic, reflecting the interplay between political authority, economic activity, and communal obligations. Elite families maintained control through patronage, military oversight, and administrative duties, while craftspeople and merchants provided essential goods, services, and trade networks. Religious institutions mediated between these groups, enforcing moral and legal norms that reinforced urban cohesion. Archaeological evidence supports the presence of both hierarchy and interaction, illustrating a complex urban ecology in which governance, economy, and culture were mutually reinforcing. By the end of the 10th century, the concentration of resources, population, and authority in urban centers provided the Kievan state with both economic strength and social cohesion. Cities functioned as engines of political power, facilitating tribute collection, craft production, trade, and administration. The integration of elite, craft, and religious structures enabled effective coordination across the riverine network, laying the groundwork for expansion of influence into peripheral territories. Economic strength sustained military expansion, as urban hubs supplied resources, manpower, and strategic oversight for campaigns along rivers and into neighboring regions. The organization of cities into specialized quarters, fortified compounds, and marketplaces demonstrates that urban development was inseparable from state formation, reflecting how Kievan Rus leveraged concentrated social and economic structures to project authority and maintain cohesion. Power rested on armed retinues, with the Druzina forming the core of Kievan Rus military and political authority. The Druzina was a professional warrior retinue attached to the prince, combining military, administrative, and ceremonial functions. Archaeological evidence from burial sites in Kiev, Novgorod, and Smolensk shows graves containing weapons, horse equipment, and imported artifacts, confirming the dual martial and elite status of these warriors. The size and composition of the Druzina varied according to the resources and strategic needs of the prince, but their organization was highly structured, reflecting both Scandinavian and indigenous Slavic influences. Commanded directly by the prince, the Druzina ensured the enforcement of political authority across urban and rural settlements. These forces were capable of rapid mobilization along river corridors, leveraging the interconnected waterways of Eastern Europe for logistical advantage. Contemporary chronicles and later sources, such as the primary chronicle, describe campaigns ranging from tribute collection to defense against steppe incursions, illustrating the operational versatility of the retinue. Material evidence of fortified settlements, watchtowers, and river crossings supports the strategic use of the Druzina in both offensive and defensive operations. Tactically, the Druzina employed combined infantry and cavalry maneuvers adapted to the riverine and forested terrain of Rus. Horse equipment and weaponry, including spears, axes, swords, and shields, recovered from burial sites, indicate an ability to engage both in close-quarters combat and in mobile raiding tactics. Scandinavian influence is evident in the design of swords and the presence of runic inscriptions on weapons and personal items, while local adaptations reflect an understanding of the steppe forest environment and logistical constraints. The composition of the Druzina was both ethnically and socially diverse. Scandinavian warriors, or Varangians, served alongside Slavic retainers, blending combat traditions and reinforcing political alliances. Leadership roles within the retinue often included senior commanders drawn from both the prince's family and experienced warriors, creating a hierarchical chain of command capable of independent action while maintaining allegiance to the prince. Archaeological evidence of weapon caches and high-status graves suggests that loyalty was reinforced through material reward, social prestige, and integration into political networks. Military campaigns were closely tied to economic and diplomatic objectives. The Druzina facilitated tribute collection, secured trade routes, and defended urban centers against both nomadic and regional adversaries. Naval capabilities along the Dnieper and Volga rivers allowed for rapid deployment of forces, raids on southern territories, and protection of trade convoys. Excavations of ship remnants and river fortifications demonstrate the logistical sophistication required for coordinated military action across dispersed settlements. The Druzina also played a role in political succession and internal governance. Military loyalty was a key factor in legitimizing princely authority, deterring rebellion, and managing rival claimants to power. Chronicles describe disputes among princes that were mediated or enforced through the Druzina, illustrating its function as both a coercive and stabilizing institution. Archaeological evidence of garrisoned fortifications and weapons distributed across principalities supports the presence of a semi-permanent military infrastructure tied to political control. Warfare in Kievan Rus was not limited to regional conflicts. It included interactions with steppe nomads, Scandinavian neighbors, and Byzantine forces. Military expeditions often combined raiding, tribute enforcement, and alliance building. Byzantine texts, including accounts of Rus activity along the Black Sea, corroborate chronicle descriptions of campaigns and highlight the Druzina's role in projecting Rus power beyond its core territories. Material finds of foreign arms and armor suggest adaptation of foreign techniques and integration of imported technology into local military practice. Logistical organization was central to Druzina operations. Supplies, horse fodder, and weapons had to be transported efficiently along rivers, supported by storage depots and fortified staging points. Archaeological evidence, including fortified river crossings, granaries, and urban storehouses, indicates that military campaigns were supported by coordinated infrastructure, enabling sustained operations over significant distances. This integration of logistics, mobility, and local knowledge underpinned the effectiveness of Kievan Rus forces. The Druzina also reinforced social hierarchy and political legitimacy. Membership conveyed status, access to wealth, and proximity to princely power. Elite warriors could influence political decisions, participate in administration, and negotiate local disputes, creating a fusion of military and political authority. Burial evidence, including richly furnished graves with imported weapons and luxury items, illustrates the symbolic as well as practical dimensions of Druzina service. By the late 10th century, the Druzina had become a professionalized, versatile force capable of both defending the state and enabling territorial expansion. Its integration of Scandinavian and Slavic elements, combined with riverine mobility and logistical organization, created a military foundation that supported political consolidation, trade protection, and diplomatic engagement. Rus navigated between empire and steppe, balancing military ambition, diplomacy, and survival in a landscape shaped by powerful neighbors. From the late 9th century onward, Kievan Rus leaders engaged in a series of military and diplomatic interactions with both the Byzantine Empire and the nomadic steppe peoples. These relationships were defined by strategic necessity, trade interests, and the projection of military power along key river corridors. Byzantine sources, including chronicles by Leo the Deacon and John Skylitzes, describe Rus raids along the Black Sea coast, the siege of Constantinople in 941, and subsequent treaties, demonstrating both the martial capability and the political ambition of the early Rus state. Archaeological evidence, including fortified settlements, imported Byzantine coinage, and weapons caches, corroborates these accounts, situating Rus activity within a broader geopolitical context. Campaigns against Byzantium often combined strategic raids with negotiation. The Rus relied on their riverine mobility, using the Dnieper and tributaries to transport forces swiftly to the Black Sea. Siege tactics, naval logistics, and coordinated assaults reflect a sophisticated understanding of both local terrain and imperial defenses. The outcomes of these campaigns were rarely decisive militarily, but they generated leverage for diplomatic negotiations, tribute arrangements, and marital alliances. The Treaty of 944 CE, for example, formalized trade rights, tribute obligations, and political recognition, reflecting the interplay of coercion and diplomacy. Interactions with steppe peoples, particularly the Pecheneg and other nomadic confederations, were characterized by both conflict and accommodation. Steppe groups controlled the southern periphery of Kievan Rus and posed continuous threats to trade routes and settlements. Archaeological evidence of fortified outposts, defensive ditches, and weapon deposits in southern principalities suggests that Rus leaders invested significant resources in border security. Chronicles describe both punitive campaigns against steppe raiders and negotiated alliances, highlighting the fluid and contingent nature of frontier politics. The combination of external campaigns and diplomacy required careful coordination of military, economic, and political resources. The Druzina served as both the instrument of power projection and the guarantor of internal cohesion, enabling princes to respond rapidly to threats while maintaining control over tributary territories. The movement of troops, collection of tribute, and maintenance of fortified settlements were tightly linked, reflecting a governance system in which military, economic, and administrative structures were mutually reinforcing. Treaties with Byzantium illustrate the integration of Rus into Mediterranean and Eurasian diplomatic networks. Agreements established by Vladimir and his successors included clauses on safe passage for merchants, tribute payments, and recognition of Rus political authority. Byzantine coinage and luxury goods found in Kiev and Novgorod indicate that these diplomatic arrangements facilitated commerce and cultural exchange, linking Rus material culture with imperial standards. These treaties provided not only economic benefits but also enhanced legitimacy for Rus rulers, reinforcing dynastic authority at home. Conflicts with steppe nomads also shaped military strategy and settlement patterns. Pecheneg raids prompted the construction of fortified towns, watchtowers, and river defenses. Archaeological excavations reveal that these fortifications were concentrated along southern rivers, serving as both early warning systems and protective enclosures for communities. Military campaigns, often seasonal, combined offensive action with tribute negotiation, illustrating a flexible approach to border management that balanced coercion and diplomacy. The cyclical interaction with external powers had internal ramifications. While successful campaigns and treaties enhanced prestige and secured economic advantage, they also placed considerable strain on resources. Mobilization of the Druzina, maintenance of fortifications, and tribute collection required administrative and logistical coordination, often challenging the capacity of local institutions. Archaeological evidence of urban expansion, storage facilities, and resource distribution highlights both the strengths and the limitations of the Kievan administrative apparatus. Rus leaders also leveraged alliances with steppe groups and neighboring principalities to reinforce strategic objectives. Intermarriage, political patronage, and negotiated agreements allowed princes to create buffer zones and secure trade routes. Byzantine diplomatic records and Rus chronicles confirm that such arrangements were integral to sustaining both territorial integrity and economic continuity. The capacity to manage these complex networks of interaction underscores the sophistication of Kievan Rus political and military organization. By the mid-11th century, Kievan Rus had achieved a measure of external stability, maintaining negotiated relationships with Byzantium while managing steppe threats through both force and diplomacy. However, the demands of military campaigns, border defense, and tribute enforcement introduced latent pressures on governance and urban resources. The integration of external success into internal administration illustrates the duality of Rus expansion. Achievement abroad reinforced authority at home, yet masked the growing challenges of political coordination, economic management, and dynastic rivalry. External success masked internal strain, as the demands of warfare, tribute, and diplomacy exposed vulnerabilities within the administrative and social structures of Kievan Rus. The need to balance military engagement with governance, commerce, and civic order would become a recurring challenge for the Rus state, influencing succession disputes, regional autonomy, and the allocation of resources in subsequent centuries. Under Yaroslav, Rus reached maturity, consolidating legal, cultural, and political structures that defined the apex of the Kievan state. Yaroslav I, known as Yaroslav the Wise, ruled from 1019 to 1054 CE and presided over a period of remarkable institutional, cultural, and legal development. His reign consolidated the political authority of Kiev while strengthening ties with European and Byzantine powers. Sources such as the Primary Chronicle, corroborated by Byzantine and Scandinavian records, depict Yaroslav as both a military strategist and a legislative innovator, actively shaping the state's internal cohesion and external influence. Archaeological evidence from Kiev, Novgorod, and other principalities confirms extensive construction projects, ecclesiastical patronage, and urban expansion consistent with these accounts. One of Yaroslav's most enduring contributions was the codification of law. The Russkaya Pravda, compiled under his direction, standardized legal practices across the principality. It addressed property rights, commerce, criminal offenses, and dispute resolution, providing a coherent legal framework that reflected both indigenous customs and influences from Byzantine legal principles. Manuscript fragments, inscriptions, and references in later chronicles indicate that the codification was widely circulated and enforced in urban centers, creating a mechanism for regulating social behavior and economic activity while reinforcing princely authority. Cultural patronage was another hallmark of Yaroslav's reign. He commissioned the construction of monumental churches, including the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, which combined Byzantine architectural techniques with local innovation. Archaeological studies of these complexes reveal imported mosaics, frescoes, and liturgical artifacts, highlighting the integration of Rus into broader Orthodox cultural networks. Monastic schools associated with these churches became centers for literacy, religious instruction, and manuscript production, ensuring the dissemination of Cyrillic literacy and ecclesiastical knowledge throughout the principality. Urban development flourished under Yaroslav's policies. Fortifications, marketplaces, and craft districts expanded in Kiev, Novgorod, and Chernihiv, reflecting both economic growth and strategic planning. Excavations of storage facilities, workshops, and residential quarters indicate organized urban layouts designed to facilitate administration, trade, and social regulation. The combination of legal codification, ecclesiastical authority, and urban planning strengthened the integration of diverse communities under central governance. Diplomacy and marriage alliances reinforced political stability. Yaroslav married his children into European royal families, establishing ties with France, Norway, Poland, and Hungary. Byzantine chronicles confirm marital exchanges with the imperial family, underscoring the dual function of diplomacy in both international recognition and domestic legitimacy. These alliances enhanced Rus' standing in Europe while embedding Kievan elites into transregional political networks. Military organization continued to support these achievements. Yaroslav maintained the Druzina as a professional retinue, ensuring both defense and internal enforcement. Fortifications along key river routes, supplemented by garrisons and strategic settlements, protected trade corridors and urban centers. Archaeological evidence of weapon caches, defensive earthworks, and fortified river crossings highlights the ongoing integration of military capacity into governance, facilitating both internal control and external projection of power. Religious and educational initiatives reinforced social cohesion. Monasteries and churches served not only as spiritual centers, but also as administrative and judicial hubs. Clergy mediated disputes, collected records, and educated future officials. Material evidence, including liturgical objects, inscriptions, and manuscript fragments, demonstrates the extent of literacy and bureaucratic capacity, reflecting the combination of ecclesiastical and secular authority in maintaining political order. The economic infrastructure supported these developments. Trade networks along the Dnieper, Volga, and Black Sea facilitated the movement of furs, silver, and agricultural products, integrating urban centers and rural hinterlands. Coin hoards, weights, and imported goods recovered from urban sites indicate that commerce remained central to state capacity, funding construction projects, military campaigns, and diplomatic initiatives. Yaroslav's policies ensured that economic, political, and cultural systems were mutually reinforcing, enabling a period of sustained prosperity. Despite these achievements, structural risks accompanied success. Centralized authority depended on the loyalty of the Druzina, the compliance of regional elites, and the stability of succession practices. Chronicles note recurring disputes among Yaroslav's sons, illustrating the potential for fragmentation even during periods of institutional strength. Archaeological evidence of fortified towns and defensive measures across principalities reflects both external threats and the anticipation of internal conflict. By the end of Yaroslav's reign, Kievan Rus had achieved a degree of political, legal, and cultural maturity unprecedented in Eastern Europe. Legal codification, urban expansion, ecclesiastical development, literacy, and diplomatic engagement collectively reinforced the cohesion and prestige of the state. These achievements provided a foundation for subsequent generations, even as latent challenges in succession and regional autonomy foreshadowed the eventual decentralization of the Kievan polity. Law stabilized a vast realm, providing Kievan Rus with the institutional framework to manage its expanding territories and diverse populations. Under Yaroslav the Wise, the codification of law became a cornerstone of governance. The Ruskaya Pravda, the earliest known legal code of Kievan Rus, consolidated customary law, princely edicts, and practices influenced by Byzantine and Scandinavian models. Manuscript fragments and references in later chronicles confirm its circulation across urban centers, illustrating its role as both a legal and administrative tool. The code addressed a wide spectrum of issues, including property rights, debt, criminal offenses, commercial disputes, and procedures for resolving interpersonal conflicts, providing a coherent framework for governance across a sprawling and culturally diverse principality. The Ruskaya Pravda formalized existing practices while introducing standardized procedures. For example, it prescribed fines for homicide vira, regulating retribution and compensating victims, and established legal mechanisms for resolving disputes over land, trade, and inheritance. Archaeological evidence of property markers, boundary stones, and estate layouts supports the enforcement of these laws, demonstrating that codification was not merely symbolic but actively implemented in daily life. By providing clear norms, the code strengthened princely authority, reduced local arbitrariness, and reinforced social cohesion. Urban centers became key nodes for administering justice. Courts convened by princes or their representatives adjudicated cases, collected fines, and monitored compliance. Ecclesiastical authorities also played a complementary role, particularly in moral and ritual matters, bridging secular and religious jurisdiction. Inscriptions, liturgical records, and clerical documentation illustrate the integration of church oversight into civic governance, reflecting a multi-tiered legal system that combined local custom, written law, and religious authority. Economic regulation was central to the code's function. Trade disputes, taxation, and commercial contracts were standardized under legal principles, ensuring predictability for merchants and urban populations. Archaeological evidence of marketplaces, coin hoards, and imported trade goods confirms the practical application of law to economic life. By codifying rights and responsibilities, Yaroslav reinforced the economic foundations of the state, enabling urban centers to function efficiently while facilitating trade with Byzantium, Scandinavia, and the Islamic world. The Ruskaya Pravda also served as a tool for political consolidation. By defining legal authority and codifying social obligations, the code strengthened the prince's position relative to the Druzina, regional elites, and urban communities. Legal uniformity enhanced communication across dispersed territories, allowing Kievan Rus to maintain cohesion despite geographic distance and cultural variation. Archaeological evidence of administrative centers, fortified towns, and urban planning supports the interpretation that legal codification was closely linked to effective governance and territorial control. Legal codification had broader social implications. By standardizing penalties and procedures, it reduced reliance on private vengeance, clarified property rights, and formalized obligations between social strata. Craft specialists, merchants, peasants, and elites operated within predictable frameworks, facilitating economic production, urban administration, and dispute resolution. The integration of written law into governance helped transform Kievan Rus from a collection of tributary principalities into a more cohesive polity capable of projecting authority regionally. Despite its strengths, legal codification could not eliminate structural vulnerabilities. Enforcement depended on the capacity and loyalty of regional elites, the presence of fortified urban centers, and the cooperation of ecclesiastical authorities. Succession disputes and local autonomy continued to challenge central authority, highlighting the limits of codification in addressing political fragmentation. Archaeological evidence of fortifications, garrison towns, and periodic destruction layers reflects ongoing tensions between central law and local realities. By the mid-11th century, the Ruskaya Pravda had become both a practical legal instrument and a symbol of Kievan authority. It standardized governance, strengthened urban administration, regulated commerce, and reinforced princely power, contributing to the golden age of Kievan Rus. At the same time, the structural fragility of succession, regional independence, and geographic dispersion meant that stability remained contingent, dependent on continued enforcement, elite cooperation, and central oversight. Stability was fragile, as the mechanisms that codified law, coordinated governance, and regulated society required ongoing attention and resources. The achievements of legal codification under Yaroslav provided a durable institutional framework, yet they also underscored the inherent challenges of maintaining centralized authority across a complex and geographically expansive medieval state. Rus became many states, as centralized authority fragmented and regional principalities gained autonomy across Eastern Europe. By the late 11th century, the Kievan state faced increasing challenges to central authority. Succession disputes among Yaroslav the Wise's sons had already introduced the principle of uppunnage, dividing territory among multiple heirs. Over successive generations, this practice produced a network of semi-independent principalities, including Kiev, Novgorod, Chernihiv, Smolensk, and Vladimir Suzdal. Chronicles and genealogical records demonstrate that each principality maintained its own administration, military resources, and legal adaptations, while nominally acknowledging the senior prince in Kiev. Archaeological evidence, including fortified centers, localized coinage, and distinctive material culture, confirms the emergence of regional identities and autonomous governance. The decentralization process reflected both dynastic custom and geographic constraints. River networks facilitated internal trade and communication, but distances between principalities, coupled with challenging terrain, limited effective centralized control. Urban archaeological surveys show that regional centers developed independent marketplaces, craft workshops, and defensive fortifications, suggesting that economic self-sufficiency became increasingly necessary. Local elites exercised political and military authority with minimal intervention from Kiev, reinforcing the structural fragmentation of the state. Administrative decentralization extended to legal and fiscal systems. While the Ruskaya Pravda provided a common legal framework, its interpretation and enforcement varied across principalities. Local courts, often overseen by princes or their deputies, adapted the code to regional conditions, while ecclesiastical authorities administered church law independently in monasteries and parishes. Archaeological evidence, such as property markers, fortified estates, and regional coinage, highlights the differentiated governance structures that characterized the fragmenting polity. The rise of regional princely power also altered social and military organization. Each principality maintained its own druzina, supplemented by local levies drawn from urban and rural communities. This duplication of armed forces reinforced territorial autonomy but reduced coordination across the broader state. Excavations of fortified towns, watchtowers, and weapon deposits indicate that military capacity became decentralized, reflecting the political realities of semi-independent principalities. Economic fragmentation accompanied political decentralization. While trade continued along river corridors, principalities increasingly controlled taxation, tolls, and resource allocation independently. Archaeological findings from Kiev, Novgorod, and Smolensk reveal localized marketplaces, storage facilities, and craft districts, demonstrating that urban and rural centers were adapting to autonomous administration. Economic self-reliance became essential for principalities facing both internal competition and external threats. The fragmentation of authority was both structural and symbolic. Dynastic rivalry often led to conflict over succession, territorial claims, and tribute rights. Chronicles report frequent disputes among princes, illustrating the fragile balance between nominal allegiance to Kiev and local independence. Material evidence of fortified settlements, defensive earthworks, and urban expansion highlights the practical measures taken by regional rulers to consolidate and defend their authority amid political uncertainty. Decentralization also affected external relations. Principalities negotiated separately with neighboring powers, including steppe nomads, the Byzantine Empire, and emerging northern states. Diplomatic correspondence, trade agreements, and military campaigns indicate that regional rulers exercised independent foreign policy, often prioritizing local interests over collective security. This autonomy enabled tactical flexibility but weakened the unified response to external threats. By the early 12th century, the Kievan state had effectively transformed into a loose federation of principalities. While Kiev retained symbolic and religious authority as the senior seat, its capacity to enforce political and military control across the network of regional centers was limited. Archaeological and textual evidence demonstrates a shift in administrative focus toward local governance, with urban centers and fortified towns acting as the primary loci of power. External threats increasingly exploited these divisions. Steppe nomads, including the Cumans, recognized the fragmented political landscape, launching raids that targeted individual principalities rather than the state as a whole. Simultaneously, the weakened cohesion limited coordinated responses to incursions, reducing the effectiveness of the Druzina and regional defenses. The decentralization of authority, while supporting local governance and cultural development, simultaneously undermined the strategic capacity of Kievan Rus as a unified polity. Political decentralization transformed Kievan Rus from a centralized state into a constellation of semi-independent principalities, each with its own military, economic, and legal structures. This fragmentation created both opportunity and vulnerability. Regional rulers exercised autonomy and fostered local development, yet their independence exposed the state to external exploitation. The structural shifts that emerged during this period would shape the trajectory of Rus politics, setting the stage for both internal conflict and the eventual vulnerability to foreign invasion. Rus survived in fragments, as the collapse of centralized authority gave rise to new regional powers that preserved and adapted Kievan traditions. Following the Mongol invasion and the fragmentation of the Kievan state, several principalities emerged as political, economic, and cultural centers, each inheriting aspects of the Rus legacy. Novgorod in the north developed a distinctive urban republican model characterized by strong merchant influence, local assemblies, and limited princely authority. Archaeological excavations reveal substantial urban planning, marketplaces, craft production, and fortified riverine positions, demonstrating that Novgorod became both a commercial hub and a center for civic administration within the constraints of Mongol suzerainty. Vladimir Suzdal, situated in the northeast, consolidated power through dynastic centralization and strategic fortifications. Its princes maintained the Druzina, reinforced urban centers, and leveraged river networks to control trade and resources. Archaeological evidence from Vladimir, Suzdal, and surrounding towns shows fortified compounds, churches, and urban workshops, reflecting continuity of administrative, religious, and economic practices inherited from Kievan Rus. The principality became a political and military nucleus that would later influence the rise of Muscovy. In the southwest, Galicia Volhynia emerged as a regional center combining Kievan traditions with interactions in Central Europe. Chronicles and archaeological findings document fortified urban centers, monasteries, and trade contacts with Poland and Hungary. Its rulers adopted administrative, legal, and ecclesiastical frameworks modeled on Kievan precedents, facilitating economic growth and regional diplomacy. Galicia Volhynia served as both a repository of Rus cultural identity and a bridge to Western political and commercial networks. Despite political fragmentation, these successor states maintained continuity in legal, religious, and social structures. The Russkaya Pravda and ecclesiastical practices persisted across the principalities, regulating commerce, property, and social interactions. Churches and monasteries preserved literacy, manuscript production, and clerical education, ensuring that cultural and administrative knowledge survived the political collapse. Archaeological evidence of religious artifacts, manuscript fragments, and urban organization highlights the resilience of institutional frameworks across diverse regional contexts. Economic networks also adapted to the new political landscape. Novgorod leveraged northern trade routes to the Baltic, while Vladimir Suzdal and Galicia Volhynia controlled riverine connections and overland routes. Material culture, including imported silver, coinage, and craft products, demonstrates that despite Mongol oversight and regional autonomy, Rus' economic activity remained interconnected, supporting urban development, craft specialization, and diplomatic engagement. The division into successor states reflected both necessity and adaptation. Geographic dispersion, river networks, and defensive considerations shaped the rise of independent principalities, while Mongol suzerainty imposed tributary obligations that influenced governance and interprincely relations. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that local elites retained significant autonomy, balancing tribute obligations with regional administration, urban development, and cultural patronage. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, these successor states collectively preserved the identity, institutions, and culture of Kievan Rus, even as political centralization was no longer possible. Their survival illustrates the adaptability of Rus governance, economy, and culture, demonstrating that the collapse of Kiev did not signify the disappearance of Rus civilization, but rather its reorganization along regional lines. Memory shaped identity, as each principality maintained historical and cultural continuity while negotiating new political realities. Legal codes, ecclesiastical structures, urban centers, and dynastic traditions were selectively preserved, adapted, and transmitted, ensuring that Rus identity endured across centuries and regions, forming the foundation for later Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian historical consciousness. Before we conclude, make sure to subscribe to Nightfall History and click the bell icon to follow the full journey through the world's greatest civilizations. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Rus history fascinated you the most? Your engagement helps us bring more in-depth, evidence-based historical documentaries directly to you.